Welcome to Crossroads. The Chinese regime has been using the International Criminal Police Organization, that's Interpol, as a tool for transnational repression. Folks, we fund Interpol. We're one of the biggest funders of it. The CCP is using the thing we're funding as its own person. Look, in a recent case, Alibaba co-founder Jack Ma, he has been implicated in a CCP campaign to export its abuses into other countries. One example of many. But look, this is just the latest where the organization of 196 member countries, the U.S. is one of the biggest funders, has been manipulated by the communist regime in China to work as its own police force. Now look, first off, this is what happened with Jack Ma. Guardian says this. It says the Chinese regime enlisted Jack Ma, the billionaire co-founder of Alibaba, in an intimidation campaign to press a businessman to help in the purge of a top official. Documents seen by the Guardian suggest, they say. It says the businessman, who can be named only as H for fear of reprisals against his family still in China, faced a series of threats from the Chinese state in an attempt to get him to return home from France, where he was living. It says they included a barrage of phone calls, the arrest of his sister, and the issuing of a red notice, that's an international alert, through Interpol. They used Interpol. Now it says this as well. The climax in April 2021 was the call from Ma. It says, quote, "They said, I'm the only one who can persuade you to return," he said. And notes that H, who had known Ma for many years, recorded the call. He had done the same for calls he had received from other friends, as well as Chinese security officials who had called in the weeks before, all with the same message. Interesting. Now, I know people personally who've also gotten calls like that. The CCP will try to intimidate them, try to use their family members to pressure them. This is one of the ways they do it. Now, it says the individual who was targeted, referred to again just as H in the reports, he's a Singapore citizen. He was born in China. But when this whole thing went down with Jack Ma, he was arrested in France, effectively under an order from the Chinese Communist Party. Basically, here's what happened. Chinese Communist Party police issued a warrant for his arrest. They were charging him for financial crime, quote unquote. They do that all the time. And it says they wanted to, extradite the man to China. The regime went through Interpol as a way of doing that. They put out a red notice on the International Criminal Alert System. And since France is part of that whole international agreement, which we finance, by the way, French authorities then took the man's passport and had to decide whether to extradite him. But another interesting thing with this story, it says that according to a transcript of a phone call, Jack Ma suggested to the man H that all this could go away. All this pressure, all the threats against his family, all the problem of being extradited to China, probably tortured and killed. They do torture you, then kill you. If he helped in the prosecution of a Chinese politician. That individual was Sun Lee-jun. And basically the CCP was targeting him, which we'll get into in a minute. For that politician, the Chinese Communist Party was alleging that he took bribes and manipulated the stock market. Ma told H, quote, "They are doing all of this for Sun, not for you." And it should be noted that under the Chinese Communist Party, just because someone gets accused of a crime does not mean they actually did it. In fact, I'd say usually they did not do it, especially with international stuff. The Chinese Communist Party very often fabricates charges because, doing so lets them manipulate the international legal system. If they tell Interpol, hey, we want to purge this official, go and arrest this guy, Interpol is not going to be able to follow the order because it has to go through the local police of the country. French police, they're probably not going to help to extradite like a religious believer or like a democracy activist, right? But if you tell them it's financial crime, then they'll do it. And so they use that. This also helps the CCP give the illusion of justice, right? This was not a purge of a political enemy. This was the arrest of a high-profile criminal. Now, the deeper context was that Sun Lee-jun was the deputy security minister in charge of security in Hong Kong during the 2017 protests. That was when the Chinese Communist Party brought a brutal end to Hong Kong's, relatively democratic system, and also faced mass protests, which it then disappeared many of the protesters. Now, here's more on that story on how Interpol is used by the CCP, though. The Guardian says this. It says the Chinese government issued a red notice for H through Interpol. Again, H being the pseudonym letter given to an individual. It says the international police watchdog. This flagged him as a potential criminal to police forces all around the world and meant he was unable to travel. And it said, quote, "It is like a pin through a butterfly," said Ted R. Brumond, an expert witness in legal cases involving Interpol procedures. And he adds, quote, "It holds someone down, locks them in place so they can't get away." The way this works is this. It says while red notices, again through Interpol, are used against serious criminals, campaigners have long warned they can be abused, and they very often are, by the way. It says the British lawyer Rhys Davies recently told a government inquiry into transnational repression that red notices were, quote, routinely used and abused by autocratic regimes to target dissidents and opponents overseas. He called the system, quote, the sniper rifle of autocrats because it is long distance, targeted, and very effective. While other countries, including Russia, Turkey, and Rwanda, have also been known to abuse the system, China's tactics are different, according to experts. Instead of relying on extraditions, the Chinese authorities use Interpol to locate people, and then they ramp up the pressure, threatening them and their family members back home until the individual agrees to return, quote-unquote, voluntarily. Because they can't necessarily extradite them, the CCP holds them in place and then attacks them with their agents. Now, notes a spokesperson for Interpol said the system meant thousands of the world's most serious criminals were arrested every year. How many of those are actually innocent people being targeted by autocratic regimes? We may never know. And look, these campaigns from the CCP, they tie into a few other things. One program is called Operation Fox Hunt. Now, that was when the CCP was using its special agents. This includes mostly agents through its Ministry of State Security, kind of like the Chinese, CIA effectively. And they were targeting dissidents all around the world, even right here in the United States. Even more shockingly, I should add, they were relatively allowed to do it. A lot of this took place during the Obama administration. They cooperated with the Chinese Communist Party on Operation Fox Hunt. They actually still do it to an extent. But again, this is under the allegation that these are criminals, but we don't really know if that's the case with a lot of them. In just one of the recent cases on this, a former NYPD officer just got sentenced to prison for 18 months for helping Chinese operatives track down one of their political targets in New Jersey. And there have actually been a lot of other ones like this. The Trump administration currently, as we speak, has been going after a lot of agents with Operation Fox Hunt. They actually have been arresting a lot of them just over the last couple months, actually, including in New York, including elsewhere. But sometimes the Chinese Communist Party's agents will also threaten their targets. Sometimes they'll try to arrest or extradite them. Other times they'll threaten their family members. They'll even try to pressure them to commit suicide, saying, you know what, all this can end, it can be on your own terms. But there are even cases where Chinese Communist Party operatives will physically harm their targets, even in other countries. That includes murder, that includes physical beatings, that includes other things. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he actually recently announced the United States has imposed sanctions on some Chinese figures who were targeting Hong Kong. And Rubio noted the CCP operatives were, quote, involved in acts of transnational repression targeting activists on U.S. soil. Now look, there was also the issue of the secret Chinese police stations, even in the United States. Even right here in New York City, there were Chinese secret police stations. And another recent investigation, Daily Caller did a fantastic job digging it up, found the Chinese Communist Party has set up what it calls a shadow justice system in the United States. So there were secret police stations in the United States. There's a shadow justice system in the United States. There are Chinese special agents in the United States. There are Interpol issues and so on, working on extraditions in cooperation with some authorities. And all of this is happening not in China, but all around the world, folks. Now, it notes that in the United States with these shadow justice systems, Daily Caller says it involves unsanctioned courtrooms in the U.S. And these are operating in California, they're operating in Washington, D.C., in Hawaii, and New York. You get that? The investigation says that, quote, although the Chinese government claims it appoints law enforcement officials overseas in order to more conveniently handle mundane matters like Chinese driver's license renewal and international divorce cases, U.S. lawmakers and intelligence analysts say China's underground courts could easily be weaponized to punish dissidents and expand communist influence abroad. I can tell you, as someone who has researched this for going on close to 20 years now, that is exactly what they do. In fact, I've been exposed to them since 2008. Now, back to what's happening through how the CCP is using Interpol, though, right, as part of these whole programs. Alibaba co-founder Jack Ma, he used to be one of the billionaire poster boys of the Chinese Communist Party's tech industry. You've probably seen him, right? That he's like the Steve Jobs of China. In reality, he just mostly copied U.S. tech. But aside from that point, he built some of the biggest companies in China, tech platforms. He'd had Ant Group, Alibaba, and so on. Back in 2021, when this whole thing went down, there was a lot of other things going on. So 2021 was when this whole alleged collaboration with Interpol took place. But at that same time, Jack Ma himself was under attack. The Chinese Communist Party blocked his Ant Group IPO. That was going to be the biggest thing on the stock market, right? One of the biggest. Now, there always tend to be surface narratives. This one didn't fly by anybody. It was pretty clear the Chinese regime was targeting Jack Ma because he criticized one of CCP leader Xi Jinping's campaigns for what they called financial oversight. In China, that just means the Communist Party is gaining more control over the businesses. That's all it actually meant. But it was also reported at the time that the regime was concerned about the power that Jack Ma could get if he were to be running what is effectively the largest IPO in the entire world. Because what happens if you have one guy running that whole thing, and that's a big chunk of the Chinese economy, and he gets arrested? Well, the stock market's going to collapse. And you can't do that normally. You don't want to do it. But the CCP did it anyway. Now, it wasn't long after all that went down that the expected happened. 2022, speculation was spreading that Jack Ma was arrested by the Chinese Communist Party. This was 1 year after his IPO was blocked, 1 year after the whole thing with Interpol. When he was arrested, it caused a $26 billion market crash of Alibaba's stock. The CCP deemed it important enough to disappear him. Now, the Chinese man called Ma was detained in the city where Alibaba is based. We don't know much about it. The news wiped $26 billion off the stock market. CCP official mouthpieces reported that this person, Ma, as in Jack Ma, we suspect, was arrested under suspicion of, quote, colluding with overseas anti-China hostile forces to, quote, incite secession and, quote, incite subversion of state power. What does that actually mean? If you're inciting secession or inciting subversion of state power, that's CCP speak for saying maybe you criticized the Chinese Communist Party. It could be that you support democracy. An important piece with all of this is that Jack Ma's business and a lot of this all went down in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was kind of like the trade zone of China until they ended its democracy effectively. And so, of course, democracy being one of the biggest issues in Hong Kong, now brought to a brutal end by the CCP. If you supported the democracy movements, they would call you a secessionist, and they would say you're trying to subvert the state. Now, look, Chinese state media rushed to assert that it was not Jack Ma, this individual Ma that was arrested at the same time that Jack Ma disappeared. But they only said that after Alibaba's stocks dropped, and after they announced it wasn't Jack Ma, the stocks rebounded. So it's not clear if that was them trying to get investors back, or if they were telling the truth, right? But something else happened. Jack Ma was effectively disappeared by the CCP, no matter how you look at it. The regime took over Alibaba. Oh yeah, we didn't disappear him. but he's gone and the Communist Party is taking over his business. Just put your money back into China, international investors. Believe us, right? That's basically what happened. That also included the news outlet, by the way, South China Morning Post, which anybody who reads China news, you'll know South China Morning Post used to be somewhat reliable. They've become more of a CCP mouthpiece. Part of the reason is Alibaba acquired South China Morning Post when Jack Ma was disappeared. That went under CCP control right along with Alibaba. That's what happened. And look, to top it all off, the Chinese Communist Party also fined Jack Ma's ant group about $1 billion. So nothing to see here. By the way, we're taking over his business and we're disappearing him. You know what this reminds me of? Have any of you seen the video from that African country when there was like a military coup, and then like people are watching cable TV, and suddenly the newscaster's gone, and there's a African general sitting in front of the news camera, and he declares that there has not been a military coup. It's a little bit like that. Now look, the new reports that are coming out now, though, that the CCP was using Jack Ma to try to target and arrest other officials, it is interesting because, look, this ties into something else, not even just about Jack Ma. This is much bigger than that. This ties into the whole CCP network of infighting, of political purges, and most importantly here, of transnational repression. The Chinese Communist Party extending its police and law into other countries. Let that sink in. The Chinese Communist Party is running a system of law in the United States, not based on US law, but based on CCP law. People can be arrested, people can be extradited, people can be disappeared. That is happening on American soil. Now look, it's not even just the US either. This is all around the world they're doing this. And this is also why the issue with Interpol is even more serious. If the CCP is using Interpol as part of that, because we fund Interpol. We're the biggest funder, by the way. Now, it's been known for a long time the Chinese Communist Party uses Interpol as part of its whole programs for international repression. This is known. This even includes issues of how the CCP has gotten key figures into leadership positions in Interpol. They use it, and they also, to an extent, control it. The Guardian was warning about this back in 2021, interestingly. It said at the time, a senior official at China's Ministry of Public Security, the MPS, this is different than in the Ministry of State Security, which is, again, Operation Fox Hunt. Ministry of Public Security is the Chinese policing organization that runs the secret Chinese police stations. That's the one that does this. The Ministry of Public Security is also the organization the CCP is using to do these international collaboration programs, training police in other countries. They're doing this in all the countries surrounding Australia. They're doing it all around Africa. They're even doing it in parts of Europe. They're subverting the police of other countries. That is the MPS. And that is also one of the main leadership heads they tried getting to control Interpol. 2021, folks. A senior official at China's Ministry of Public Security is seeking election to Interpol's executive committee, prompting concerns from human rights activists and international politicians that China could misuse the global criminal police organization's capabilities to track down overseas dissidents. They achieved that actually even prior to this. In fact, when the CCP did have one of its individuals in a leadership position there, the Chinese Communist Party even went after the person for not enforcing the CCP's interests through the use of the organization, just emphasizing what the CCP had done prior. Now notice this, though. Hu Bin-chen, the Deputy Director General of the Ministry's International Cooperation Department, the MPS, is one of 3 candidates vying for its 2 seats as Asia delegates on the committee. It says the 13-member executive committee oversees the work of Interpol's General Secretariat and helps set future policy, like the policies of the CCP, maybe. Now, it notes that Interpol controls a number of databases containing identifying details of people and property, which assist in global policing. And this is important because even aside from transnational repression, even aside from pinning a person down and then targeting them with special agents, even outside of that, if the CCP can get someone into Interpol, get one of its own officials leading the organization, it means they can also get access to those databases, details of all the people and all the property around the world. And notice it also operates a system of red notes, which are requests to locate and provisionally arrest an individual pending extradition. Pin them down, right? And they say, however, there are long-running concerns, you don't say, over governments or authorities misusing the system to track down dissidents. And now look, in another recent report, well, not recent, this is another one at the time, it noted that it once used in the hunt for fugitive criminals, the global police agency's most wanted red notice list now includes political refugees and dissidents. So this was all known. This was known, this was understood, it was allowed to happen. America did not pull its funding out of Interpol while this was happening. Interpol's continued to operate, America continues to fund it, and it was known. The CCP and other autocratic regimes do this. Now look, many human rights organizations, they've been warning about this for years. Freedom House, for example, they noted in 2021 that the Chinese Communist Party uses Interpol as a key piece of its Operation Fox Hunt campaign. 2021 Freedom House, here's what they said, quote, "The campaign was announced alongside the dissemination of a list of 100 individuals China said were sought through Interpol red notices. Like other countries, China uses Interpol notices to imply international endorsements of its pursuit, even though Interpol notices are not subject to any judicial review. An extrajudicial global police force." Now it says as well, quote, "Despite its cultivation of an image of legality and careful references to international law, at its core, the CCP's anti-corruption campaign reflects its domestic context, in which the preferences of the party states stand above all other considerations. It is useful to recall the case of Meng Hongwei, a prominent CCP official from the domestic security apparatus. Meng served as president of Interpol from 2016 until October 2018. This is important because the CCP had one of its key officials leading Interpol as the actual president before the 2021 issue of them trying to get one of their MPS agents in. This was the individual the CCP was pressuring, saying, hey, we want you to use Interpol more in line with the Chinese Communist Party's interests. That was Meng, the president of Interpol, right? And it says this, when he was abruptly arrested in China, expelled from the party, and sentenced to prison for corruption. Why did that happen? The CCP was accusing him of not doing enough to use Interpol for Communist Party interests. That's why that happened. And notes as well, quote, this sequence of events should act as a reminder of how the CCP's global anti-corruption drive is part and parcel of its overall strategy of shaping international norms to its advantage. They call it the borrowed boat strategy, by the way. What does that mean? I need a boat. I don't have a boat, but you have a boat. I'm going to borrow your boat. The CCP wants to have international policing. They don't have international policing, so what do? They borrow the system of international policing. They call that the borrowed boat strategy. That's what they're doing. Now, it's not just Freedom House. There's a lot of organizations that warned about this. Heritage Foundation, another of many examples. They were warning about the CCP's use of Interpol as part of programs to export Communist Party law into other countries. They've been warning about it for years. 2022, they said this, contrary to Hollywood, Interpol is not an international police force. It's more like a bulletin board on which police forces around the world post their wanted notices. But Interpol does have problems, and China is among the biggest. And it added, quote, even worse is China's abuse of the system. Russian abuse of Interpol is a blunt instrument. China's is a full court press. The Chinese government does not just invent crimes. It threatens families to to force its victims back to China. They say, nor is it just dissidents who are targeted. American entrepreneurs, American citizens, American entrepreneurs, it says, who have property that regimes want to steal and contracts those regimes need to violate in the process are also vulnerable. So, if you're a business person and the CCP wants what you have, they might fabricate charges against you and use Interpol to target you. There are cases where this has happened. The Heritage Foundation notes this. They say that even Americans have in fact been targeted through Interpol when they travel abroad. You go to another country, the CCP uses Interpol for a red notice, you get held by authorities, and then the Communist Party comes after you. American citizens, through an organization American taxpayers are funding. Heritage Foundation noted the CCP's use of Interpol could raise some issues with the facts that the United States, again, pays a good chunk of Interpol's bills. We pay a huge chunk of it, by the way. And we seem to do that with a lot of global organizations. It seems to be a trend here, right? And these problems have not gotten any better. A recent report, right, I showed you 2021 until now, a recent report from Red Notice Monitor, a website that monitors, again, Interpol stuff, notes that while the United States is still one of the main funders of Interpol, the organization continues to be used by the Chinese Communist Party. It notes this, quote, "The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, has weaponized international law enforcement mechanisms, particularly Interpol, to target political dissidents, human rights defenders, and critics of its regime." Like myself, by the way. And it adds that the United States seems to monitor this. It states, quote, "The misuse of Interpol red notices is monitored in part by the U.S. TRAP Act reports on transnational repression and are highlighted in the U.S. State Department reports on human rights. China's manipulation of Interpol's red notice system is unparalleled and has outpaced even Russia in scale and sophistication." I don't know, maybe some authorities think it's a necessary evil because we continue to fund it, but it is known they do this. The U.S. even tracks it. The U.S. is aware. Now look, in other news, folks, and on a very different topic, you might have seen this, a recent interview. Tucker Carlson, it's been going viral because him and his guest allege the United States has been building massive underground bases the size of cities. I'll be talking more about this after we come back from a quick break.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges. With a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold, you can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Welcome back. Has the United States been building massive underground bases? Well, yes and no. I researched it quite a bit, but let me show you what's being said. A recent Tucker Carlson interview has been going viral about this. Tucker interviewed Catherine Austin Fitts. She's a former Assistant Secretary of Housing and Federal Housing Commissioner at HUD, H-U-D, from 1989 to 1990. That was during the Bush administration. And in the video, she makes some pretty shocking claims. She alleges the United States has been building massive underground bases, some of which are as big as entire cities. Watch this.
the underground base and city infrastructure and transportation system that's been built. And
I'm sorry?
yes. So we have built an extraordinary number of underground bases and supposedly transportation systems. Some of these are documented as part of the national security infrastructure. I think there are many more.
In the United States?
In the United States, and all over the world. From 2021 to 2023, I took one of the smartest subscribers in the Slayer Report network, and he and I spent 2 years collecting all the data and all the allegations on underground bases. We systematically went through and tried to estimate our guess, this is totally a guess, of how many underground bases, both underground in the United States, but also underground under the ocean around the United States. And our estimate was 170, with a transportation network connecting them.
And what would be the purpose?
If you thought you were going to get a near extinction event,
what she alleges is that these city-sized underground bases work as a kind of backup place to live. This is in case of a civilization-ending disaster. Now look, after watching that video, I went down the rabbit hole, folks, and I looked for some evidence on this. Now, a lot of the biggest claims, the idea of I think she says 170 of these, again, some as large as cities, some of them under the ocean. I did not find any public proof on that. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying that there's no public information on it. I did find some smaller underground bases, though. They do fit this description, and actually that's what they're meant for. These are end of civilization bases. They do exist. I don't know on that scale, but I'm going to show you what I found. These are bases meant to ensure the, quote, continuity of the United States government, and they are specifically in the event of a massive disaster. These are real. Now, look, first off, on the idea that there are 170 of these, including under the ocean, I looked around. I saw some of the stuff on this. If you look at the sources of the sources, because there's books and reports on it, it seems a lot of the core claims are from alleged witnesses and other things like that. I'm not saying it's not true, but I'm saying it's effectively based on witness accounts, and so you can believe it if you want. On that point, though, there are in fact known, documented, and even public, actually, underground bases that do fit these descriptions, that actually are for the same thing she says, continuity of government operations. Now, on that point, there's about 3 of them that are generally well known. All right, folks, if you want to build a secret place where you're going to go live in case you get attacked by an enemy, what do you not want that enemy to know? All right, question, answer me. If you want to build a place to go in the event of a nuclear war or a biological weapons attack, and you want your enemy to not know about where that is, what do you not tell them? You probably don't tell them where it is. So while there are 3 of these known, I would expect, just on basic logic and security, you'd probably build a few that you don't tell everybody where they're at, right? But look, on that side, there are reports on what some people call DUMBs. Those are deep underground military bases, DUMBs. And it's mostly something like you might find on forums. Looking at this, right, it's forums, it's a handful of websites, it's some books. A lot of them have images of these huge tunnel boring machines. I mean, they're probably the size of maybe like a 5-story building, and circular because they drill. Elon Musk is also Elon Musk actually is building these. His vision is he wants to create interconnecting underground tunnels used for logistics and shipping. So they are building these things. I mean, he has what's called the Boring Company. He thought it was very funny. The Boring Company, as in boring holes, right? But also boring because it sounds boring. There's also images of a lot of underground tunnels with this. It's not clear the context. If you can show an underground tunnel, it can be anything effectively. It's hard to verify any of this because the sourcing, again, is mostly just based on word of mouth. But with that said, there are publicly known underground facilities specifically to work as bases to keep the government running in the event of a basically world-ending disaster. Now, one of these, I'm going to show you some of them. One of these is the Cheyenne Mountain Complex. This is in Colorado. This military command center was built into a mountain during the Cold War. Remember, that was when everybody was worried about global nuclear, apocalypse, basically, right? They were building systems and things in case we went to war with the Soviet Union. This was one of them. Now, according to the official website of NORAD, they have a website on this. NORAD is one of the groups, by the way, that runs the thing as we speak. I did notice the website appears to have been pulled offline. I found an archive of it. This is the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD. It says the base is still used by NORAD. This is operational. It exists. It's also used by U.S. Strategic Command, U.S. Air Force Space Command, and U.S. Northern Command, different command structures of the U.S. military. Now, it says this underground base in Colorado is one of several centers that supports the NORAD mission of aerospace warning and aerospace control and improvised warning of ballistic missile, as in nuclear bombs, or air attacks against North America. It also says it functions as the, quote, alternative command center, which is important here because that's the program to maintain the government in the event of a basically world-ending disaster. They have alternative command centers set up for the continuity of the government. And that's what it means, basically. If, for example, there's a huge war, maybe not even a world anything, if there's a huge war, their main command center gets taken out, this is the alternative one. This is the hardened one, the protected one, the one that's going to be harder to destroy. That's what this is for. It's also used as a training site for those branches of those military. It's public, this is known. Another one of these is the Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center in Virginia. Now, that is also a government facility meant to be used for high-level officials in the event of an emergency. Allegedly, I should say, but there's more evidence on this. They refer to this one specifically as a, quote, continuity of government site. They refer to it as that. And we know about this from declassified documents. It's also generally acknowledged. This one, it's pseudo-secret, but it's not that secret, right? There's some public documents, even public photos on it. We know this exists as well. So that is, in fact, one of them. There's also the Raven Rock Site R, that's in Pennsylvania. This is another continuity of government site. That's the technical phrase for these, continuity of government. This one is also allegedly designed to keep the military functioning in the event of a disaster or crisis. This was built by the Department of Defense as an emergency center, as in a disaster, again, and also as an electronic control center. And it's officially called, right, the new official name, they call it the Alternate Joint Communication Center. Again, alternate as an alternative if the main one gets destroyed. And again, it exists as a location to help the United States still function in the event of a massive disaster. There's public reporting on it. This is not secret. It's not secret, but they seem to have pulled some of the websites offline. The ones I'm showing you are archives because I can find them. And look briefly on that government program as well that these are tied in with. Just going on the point that this interview was alleging, right, with Tucker Carlson. This ties into actual government programs. So without a doubt, these do exist. There are government programs on them. There's a publicly acknowledged government operation called the Continuity of Government Program, and they refer to these as Continuity of Government Sites. This is the official web page of the Department of Labor talking about these. It says this, quote, this is the page currently available online. This is not an archive. It says the Continuity of Government, COG program, represents the President's intent that the United States have in place a comprehensive and effective program to ensure survival of our constitutional form of government and continuity of essential federal functions under all circumstances. It says Presidential Policy Directive 40, National Continuity Policy, dated July 15, 2016, provides policy guidance. It actually predates that. That would have been like beginning of Trump years, but really end of Obama years. These programs actually predate that, but that's one of the areas that the directives comes from. But it adds this: continuity is a federal initiative required by presidential directive to ensure that executive branch departments and agencies, including the U.S. Department of Labor, are able to continue to perform their essential functions during disasters or incidents that threaten to disrupt normal operations, including, it says, natural, man-made, and technological emergencies. Like maybe the robot apocalypse, right? I'm joking, it's probably like power outages, right? So there are, in fact, massive networks of bases to an extent. I don't know about under the oceans. We know about 3 of these. 3 of them publicly acknowledged. I don't know about 170 of these, as the interviewee is noting. I don't know about ones as large as cities. Even these ones, you don't really know how big they are. It's secret, obviously. I have no idea if there are more than 3. I can tell you after researching quite a bit, I only found 3 that are publicly acknowledged. I will say, again, if you want to create a site to protect you against like nuclear war or something like that, you're probably not going to tell your enemies where they're located, because in the event of a war, they will probably bomb it. If you want to create a secret site, how do you keep a site secret? You don't tell anyone about it. So I would imagine, without a doubt, there are probably some like this that they don't publicly disclose. I don't know about that many of them, but there are ones designed specifically to keep the government functioning. What the interviewee was suggesting is that there are additional ones basically as alternate civilizations that basically to protect, the American people. That, if there were a disaster, that we would have a place to go, not just the government, which is a nice thought. The publicly disclosed ones are only to keep the government running. We'll be left to roam the wastelands, I'm afraid, unless they reveal the other ones which are alleged to exist. But on the point of underground bases that function as continuity of government sites, again, those do exist. And I just wanted to show you all this because some of you had asked about it. Anyways, folks, that said, let's jump into some questions. So that said, hit the like button, leave a comment, let's jump into it. All right, let's see. First off, Ellen Jacobson, you're saying, Mr. Philipp, does the U.S. government take China seriously now? I don't see enough about the threat from other reporters. Mostly people I know still don't get it. It's getting a bit better, but I would say a lot of journalists, I don't think a lot of journalists fully understand the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, especially mainstream news. And I'd say actually even worse now because of a lot of CCP propaganda. Like some of the alt-right types, they're even like China-based because, it's an authoritarian regime that just kills anybody who opposes it. This is what's important to understand. So, for example, if you were to have like an Antifa in China, they would probably round you up, torture you, and harvest your organs and kill you. If you were to try to have like a Black Lives Matter in China, they would probably round you up, put you up against a wall, and shoot you. They would not do it. And so because you have some of these, I wouldn't call them like conservatives, but like what James Lindsay would call the woke right, you do have people who are alleged conservatives, but they actually embrace like Trotskyism. They embrace Trotskyist communism, right? A lot of them. A lot of them are also syndicalists, which is like effectively like a government run by unions. I wouldn't say they're conservatives, but you do have some of those people who, seem to like that kind of stuff. The deeper context of it is this: communism uses revolutionaries to gain power. Once communism gains power, it kills the revolutionaries because it does not want destabilization. There are people a regime will use to overthrow an existing government and to install their own system of power. Once they do that, they murder all the people who helped them. Mao Zedong, for example, he gained power with a lot of the help of what they call the Little Red Guard. These were your basically like true believer college kids, right? These were your college kids who really believed in the communist narrative and they were fighting for Comrade Mao. Do you know what Mao did with them as soon as he took power? He sent them all to the countryside to become peasants. He got rid of all of them. Like, good job, comrades. Time to go and serve the motherland by becoming like the poorest people in the entire country, running our farmlands, which is in China like probably the hardest job. It's probably worse than most forms of slave labor. It is a horrible fate in China. You know, when you have these like TikTok influencers going to China, like, wow, China's living in the future. Look, these people are like they're like glorified moths. They're looking at all like the neon lights and like, wow, this is so futuristic. What they're not seeing is like the countryside where people are living on like $60 a week or something like that. You know what I mean? They're not seeing people like, I mean, you want to talk about people living in worse conditions than medieval Europe. That's your Chinese countryside. To say they're backwards is an understatement. And it's because the CCP did it to them. And a lot of those people, you know, part of those are the Little Red Guard. The Chinese Communist Party did not need them anymore, and it discarded them. Same thing with the Soviet Union. Vladimir Lenin had what he called the useful idiots. The useful idiots. And what are those? The useful idiots are the people who help a communist party come into power and then are promptly killed by the communist regime once it takes power. And so, you know, the problem we have with a lot of people is they don't understand that. When they see that China does not tolerate the, you know, woke elements, it's because they kill them. It's because they've already gotten what those woke elements would want to build. But the problem you have is those elements, typically they're the ones who become disenfranchised first if you don't kill them, because they find out that everything they were told was a lie. So communist regimes will always kill them. Look at Che Guevara in Cuba. They killed him. He was one of your useful idiot true believers. They killed him. And so, you know, you have those. They always do that. And so unfortunately, whether it's the right or the left, you do have a general misunderstanding of communism. Some on the right see that, and that's their narrative. Some on the left, you know, they just believe in communism. And New York Times, for example, you know, they're like sucking on the boot of the Chinese regime because they're like, it's state capitalism, a model for America. And, you know, they basically just run CCP propaganda half the time. I'd say it's probably because I think, based on their reporting, I truly believe that they actually just want to have a communist system. In fact, they've even had op-eds stating that directly, saying that, you know, happy birthday, Karl Marx, and saying they want to achieve his vision. Like, they don't try to hide it. And so you do have some media that ideologically want communism, and they view the Chinese Communist Party's system of, you know, basically pure communism, totalitarianism, but, you know, a relative economy, even though it functions mostly on like manufacturing cheap goods and stuff, as the model that communism could follow. And so a lot of them push the China model. You do have people ideologically aligned with them. And if that means killing religious believers and dissidents and purges, you know, they seem to think that's okay because that's just how they think. I think it's perverted, an utterly perverse worldview, but there are some who believe it. But also on that too, I think the other issue you have is that unless someone goes and studies these things in depth, you have to kind of do it on your own, because most of the media will not tell you most of what is happening. A lot of people are not going to do that of their own volition, frankly. And so a lot of them just, even if they do view the CCP as like a totalitarian evil regime, they're not going to do a lot of additional research usually. And so there are a lot of misinformed people, and usually that information is also partly informed by just propaganda and stuff. And so it's an unfortunate situation. I do think it's getting better. I think COVID was a big wake-up moment for a lot of people. I think COVID was when a lot of governments, a lot of experts, and even a lot of some journalists, but especially like, you know, some of the independent journalists, I think that was when a lot of them started realizing what the CCP was. Hong Kong was also a big wake-up moment for a lot of people. Foggy01, you're saying, Josh, I heard that China may lose 10 million jobs because of the China tariffs from U.S. Any truth in this? Yeah, it's getting really bad there. There's a lot. I've been thinking about doing something on it. Look, folks, I don't want to sound like a broken record. China's going to collapse any day now. I know some people joke with me about it because I was saying that before COVID. It looked like it was going to. It may actually happen now, partly because of the tariffs, partly because of infighting. The tariffs are big. There's something else happening in China right now that I haven't told you all about. First off, on the tariffs, what was one of the biggest problems the Chinese Communist Party was having prior to the current debate about tariffs? Do you remember what that was? How many of you remember the narrative of quote-unquote overcapacity and dumping? Dumping as in dumping products onto the market. Before Trump made this entire thing into a partisan issue, because anything Trump does, you're going to have people who just oppose him because he's Donald Trump. What was happening before that? Europe was putting restrictions on Chinese goods to protect their businesses from China dumping. Different parts of Asia were putting laws in place to prevent the dumping of Chinese products onto their market. The United States was doing it. Canada was doing it. Why were they doing it? It's because the Chinese Communist Party, this is a way to subsidize your economy, right? Remember, the Chinese Communist business model, when it comes to their economy, you would call it, some call it state capitalism. What is that? It's just communism, right? All right, folks, break it down with me. What is capitalism, and what's the difference between capitalism and state capitalism? Right? Capitalism is the free market. State capitalism is when the state gains control of the free market, meaning it is not a free market, it is a state-run business enterprise. And what do you call that? Gee, what did Karl Marx say again? Seize the means of production. Seize the means of production. What does that mean? It means that the state, the Communist Party, seizes the businesses. What is state capitalism? The state has seized these systems of capitalism. It has seized the businesses, right? So I don't know where people don't. I think a lot of people have a fundamental misunderstanding of communism because they're like, well, communism means you get rid of capitalism. No, it doesn't. Communism is when the government seizes control of the systems of capitalism. Can you name a single communist country that eliminated farming and business and things like that? No. The Soviet Union, the government controlled the factories. That was communism. It was state capitalism. North Korea, probably the most communist thing out there. The state controls the businesses, state capitalism. Every communist country is like that. The state controls the businesses. People who try to, hold water for communist parties, they don't call it communism because that sounds bad, so they call it state capitalism. The narrative for that actually goes back to just after the Bolshevik Revolution when Vladimir Lenin took over Russia. He actually had public documents on this where he wrote this. I believe the paper was called "How Can We Advance to Communism If We Fear the Stage of Capital? If we fear the stage of socialism," meaning, yeah, we've not achieved the utopia, but we have to go through the system of state totalitarianism, socialism, in order to achieve the communist utopia. And he referred to that system as state capitalism. That's what he called it. So the narrative for that comes from Vladimir Lenin, that label, right? So on that point, what was the big narrative, folks? China was dumping its products in another market. Why was the Communist Party doing that? It's because the systems of state capitalism were trying to increase production to create jobs because their economy was collapsing, even during that time. You want to keep people working, what does that mean? You need to get your construction workers going. So you build cities nobody needs. That's why they have ghost cities. You need to keep your factory workers working, even if nobody's buying the product. So what does that mean? You subsidize it, you force them to construct, and what does that mean? It means you've built a lot of products that nobody wants to buy. They call that overcapacity. Now, what's the problem with overcapacity? Well, how does the free market work? Supply and demand. So what happens when you have oversupply? Well, it means the price of the product goes down. Scarcity of goods is what raises the price. If you overproduce, you will lower the price of the product. You will lower the value of the product because you have to get rid of it. And so that was the concern for Europe. That was a concern for the US. That was a concern even for, like, there were African countries warning about it. And that was why a lot of them started putting restrictions on Chinese imports going into their countries, right? It was because they didn't want China taking all that overcapacity and dumping it on their markets, because it would cause a price crash which would affect their businesses. That included on electric cars, that included on car batteries. That was one of the big narratives with, like, the electric car industry. That included clothes and everything else, even rare earth minerals. That was the narrative. Even iron, even steel, even copper, that was the narrative, because China had been overproducing to try to revive its economy, and it wasn't working. So what does it mean if, on top of having an existing crisis of overcapacity where you need to sell your products, you've built too many of them? What does it mean when you have that problem? Well, first of all, what does that mean for the businesses? It means the businesses go out of business. Because if their entire market has been on building things at, it's more than this, but let's say you're building everything at 3 times what the market demands, what does it mean when the market corrects itself? It means that you need to reduce production by 2 elements of that. So, 1%, back to the normal, right? You need to cut production by 2/3. Now, the CCP was doing it even more than that. So what does it mean when you have businesses cut production in order to correct when you were overproducing? It means your markets crash. If it's even double production and you have to cut it in half because you've been overproducing, what does that mean for the stock market? It means half value. It means your market crashes. What does that mean for workers? It means a lot of people lose their jobs, or 50% of them maybe, and the CCP was doing it worse than 50%. That's how big this is. So what happens if you're already facing a crisis like that, and then in addition to that, you get hit by 125, 140% tariffs, and nobody wants to buy your products? It means that the crisis you are already facing has been increased exponentially. It means your businesses that were already going out of business are going to go out of business even more. That's what that means. I don't think anyone has fully wrapped their heads around how big of a deal this is. This is the decimation of the Chinese economy. And so, look, if you're talking about 10 million people losing their jobs, I'd say even prior to the tariffs, 10 million would have been a very conservative estimate. I would say it's significantly worse than that. Even the crisis prior to this, 10 million would have been a very low estimate of the number of people probably losing their jobs in China. And that's a big deal for them, because, again, you don't have a lot of consumption in China. A lot of it is, they rely more on exports than imports, right? They need to export, not import. And so when they counter U.S. tariffs by tariffing U.S. goods, it doesn't affect us that much. They don't buy a lot from us. We buy a lot from them. They don't buy a lot from us. There's a trade imbalance. The very nature of that trade imbalance is partly because of that. And so they kind of shot themselves in their own foot by doing that, because they lost their negotiating power. They lost leverage on debates on tariffs. The only thing they can get us on are rare earth minerals and medications, which they're producing now in other places. And so, temporary crisis of rare earth minerals, but there are alternative sources, and they're rapidly building those. Meaning, and even if China corrects it at this point, because it's now become a national security issue, we're probably going to build those with or without them. Even if everything gets fixed, we will probably build those still. which means they lose the one card they had to play. That's how big that is. The other big thing is infighting in China, though, and I haven't talked about this yet. Folks, there is developing, right now as we speak, what I would call a soft coup taking place in China. And almost nobody is talking about this. One of the only sources that I believe has talked about this is China in Focus on NTD television, Tiffany Meyer, one of my colleagues. Again, I do a show with her once a week. They're I think the only source that I know that has covered this thoroughly. What is happening? Xi Jinping does not control the military right now. And the people who control the military are purging Xi Jinping's loyalists. Now, let me explain. I could go into this for a long time, but let me explain the core point with all this. The Chinese military is controlled by the Central Military Commission. There are about 5 people in the Central Military Commission who basically run the military. 3 of those people are against Xi Jinping. 3 of them. Xi Jinping is one of them. There's one guy who's a Xi Jinping loyalist of the 5, right? Those 3 individuals who are part of the opposition, not only is there a purge of other Xi Jinping loyalists, they recently purged the one guy who supports Xi in the Central Military Commission, meaning Xi Jinping does not control the military. He doesn't control the military right now. And that is a big deal. That is a very big deal. I can't even emphasize what a big deal that is, because in China, the military is not like the American military. The American military, what does it do? It defends the Constitution, enemies foreign and domestic. What does the Chinese military do? It defends the Communist Party. Effectively, the military is kind of the main body of the Communist Party. The military, to put it another way, the military almost is the Communist Party. Whoever controls the military controls it. There are alternative systems of power. The businesses were a big one. Those have been decimated because of the trade war. So the power within the economy has been decimated, meaning Xi does not have that anymore. A lot of the push in Hong Kong and the purges in Hong Kong were really about a power struggle as well. And when Xi Jinping took Hong Kong, he took the economic strongholds. The economic strongholds no longer hold power, so Xi Jinping lost that. The other main stronghold is going to be People's Armed Police, the spy organizations, Ministry of Public Security, Ministry of State Security, the international elements. Xi still has a lot of control of those, which is why I believe you're seeing the issue with Interpol right now, which is why I believe you're seeing the Chinese secret police stations going into overdrive. You have Xi Jinping using a lot of the international systems to try to silence dissidents, to go against the people he believes are influencing foreign trade policies. I believe that's a reason why they're targeting the Epoch Times, for example. I think that's probably why New York Times is eating out of the CCP's hand, attacking Shen Yun. Personally, I believe that's why they're doing it. It's because, again, the systems of international control are pushing for all of that. Xi Jinping still controls that. But inside China, that is less consequential. At most, that could influence foreign investment and foreign business. And because, again, the businesses in China would be one of the key centers of power. But if Xi Jinping has lost that, which he has, and if he has lost control of the military, which he is now losing, the external systems cannot save him in China, right? Unfortunately, not many people know about this. And again, this is the problem I think you have where you don't have I don't think you have a lot of real solid China experts, unfortunately. And so a lot of people, they don't know about this stuff. Epoch Times entity, we have some fantastic sources, including in China. And so, we get this kind of stuff. It's a little bit like inside baseball, but it is important. And so that's the other side of what's happening right now. And almost nobody's really talking about it. All right, let's see here. I saw another question. Denise B., you're saying, Josh, do you think capitalism can succeed in a nation without biblical morality? To judge from history, it seems that promoting capitalism does not lead to morality, but that perhaps promoting morality is more likely to lead to capitalism. There's two sides to it. I believe in the free market. I believe in true capitalism, which is the free market. But I also believe that there is a bit of a conflict between modern capitalism and traditionalism. I think that if you were to look at pre-industrialized nations, yes, commerce existed, but the reliance on consumption was not as heavy. You could have a free system that was a very healthy system. I'd say quality of life, probably a lot better. Folks, do you know you work more than your average medieval peasant? You do. You are more of a slave to the system than your average medieval peasant. If you look at the work hours of a medieval peasant, if you look at what did you do in the winter, you work harder than a medieval peasant. And I know people are like, well, that's backwards. Well, what was life at that time? Well, you had your own, ideally, right? You definitely did have some totalitarian governments, which made this not as nice. But typically, what did that mean? If you were a woman, you probably didn't have to work. You took care of household stuff. You had kids, you had family. If you were a husband, you were typically not going to work either. You were staying in your own home. You were working in your own field. Your kids were helping you around the house. Your kids were helping on the farm. This kind of agrarian lifestyle was the foundation of most countries. Leading up to the early 1900s, like late 1800, I think more than 90% of Americans, that was life. And so even, I may be talking about like medieval society is not the right way. Late 1800s, this was normal. That was how people lived. My own grandfather, who's 80-something years old now, when he was growing up, that was still the lifestyle in America, even in like the 1950s. And so if you talk about traditionalism, I think that is more what I'm talking about. That does mean that you do have systems of commerce because, traditionalism, you sell your products, right? You have some people who are farmers. You have some people who are craftsmen. A lot of people were both, especially during the winters, because you're not farming year-round. When it's not the season to farm, you're doing other stuff. You're reading books. You're enjoying your family life. You're going fishing. You're maybe doing woodwork and stuff like that. There's other things to do. And so if you understand like leisure and time with your family and that kind of stuff, like traditionalism was what supported a lot of that. And I know people, when they think of that kind of lifestyle, think, oh, it's like slavery. Not really. Like if you look at people who still live like that, it's a very nice lifestyle. Now, I do believe you can't have social harmony without a system of morality. You have really two systems that maintain social harmony. One would be external systems of morality, the systems of law and justice. The other one would be internal systems of harmony, which is internal morality, which I believe you can't really have without religion or like a really deep moral philosophy. But I think typically the really deep moral philosophies are typically based on religion anyway, and I don't think they last more than a couple generations without a religious backing, personally. Now, is biblical morality the only one? No. Look, if you look at Buddhist societies, they're pretty harmonious too. You have other systems that have been pretty harmonious, including historically. The Greek Empire, most of the Roman Empire, maybe not towards the end. If you read a lot of the older books of like Plato and Socrates, one of my favorite writings would be The Dream of Scipio. They did talk a lot about the morality of the societies. And so if you understand even the nature of virtue and the theories on virtue, the Ethics by Socrates is one of my favorite, by Aristotle is one of my favorite books, by the way, also. They do talk about that true joy comes from virtue. And that was, like, Roman Empire type stuff. I think that it's easy for people to judge the state of an empire by the late empire systems. Typically, late empire versus mid or early empire are very different. Mid or early empire, you do tend to have a stronger moral foundation. Late empire is when you have your like Sodom and Gomorrah type stuff, when people lose that. Late empire is when, typically you do have just depravity and people lose their morals, and typically the empire does collapse. And you can look at any system in history and basically see that, right? You can see that throughout history. Now, on that point, though, biblical morality was also a very solid one. Of course, with its ups and downs, you can look at the better parts of society and the renewals. I would actually say the 1700s were one of the key breaking points. And the world went in two very different directions. What happened? Actually, I've thought about writing a book about this, but I just don't have time. This is one of my own theories on history. This is one of my own theories in terms of understanding the nature of current political discourse. What were the two key movements that took place in the 1700s? Well, you had the American Revolution and you had the French Revolution. The American Revolution created the American idea of individual liberty, the idea that the individual, in individual morality is kind of the centerpiece of social harmony and stability, and that the role of government is to protect the individual and to protect God-given rights. You can't have that without a moral foundation. And so the important context of that is that the American Revolution was actually born from what they call the Great Awakening. There was a moral and religious revival in the United States. That's what really led to the American Revolution. If you understand history, the American Revolution was actually led a lot by what they call the Black Robe Regiment, which was the priests, right? It was a lot of the Christian priests. That was the foundation of the American Revolution. And if you understand the French Revolution, what was theirs? It was about the power of the state. It was that the state is there, the protector of the people, what the state does is right. And there was also an anti-religious movement. They believed that modern science and human reason would be able to replace religion. That's why after the French Revolution took power, they established the quote-unquote cult of reason. The cult of reason. They had the goddess of reason. They carried out the de-Christianization movement where they were killing Christians and destroying religion. They were decimating churches and so on. That was the cult of reason. They believed that modern science, human reason would replace religion, and that the power would shift to the state and to the enlightened few who lead the people. Now, the important part of understanding that is that came through the age of reason. And so in Europe, you had a very different movement. You had a breaking away from religion. In Europe, people abandoned religion. And so while America had the Great Awakening, Europe had the age of reason. One abandoned God, the other went towards God. And that created two different political systems. The French Revolution led to the creation of communism, an atheistic totalitarian regime. The American idea created the idea of God-given rights and a system of freedom and liberty, where again, human morality is actually the basis of social stability. And that is effectively the story of how we got to where we are now, where you have two competing forms of government and two very radically different competing forms of ideology. I don't really think you can understand the modern world without understanding the moral and religious debates of the 1700s, because those are what created the systems that we now see competing with each other. This is one of my theories of kind of understanding how all that came about, actually. Anyways, folks, on that point, long answers, but I hope you don't mind. That said, Wednesday, folks, I got the day right again. I will see you again tomorrow, Thursday. Join me again then, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. As always, folks, please don't forget to give this video a like. It helps us a lot in the algorithm, especially on like YouTube. Be sure to leave a comment. That also helps us, by the way. That said, as always, folks, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, stay free. Thank you.